I'm Vasudha Vijayanayaka, and I work as the Executive Director of SLYCAN Trust. Welcome to this webinar, which is the third webinar in a series of webinars. We are focusing on migration and displacement induced by climate change. So we have a lineup of speakers, great speakers today, who are from different organizations and working on climate-induced migration, displacement, and other related topics to it. Without taking a lot of time, brief introduction and welcome from mine. So SLYCAN Trust is based in Sri Lanka, and we work in different parts of the world, these days mainly in Asia and Africa, in our work on research and policy-related work on climate-induced migration and displacement, in addition to adaptation and anything to do with climate change generally. So we have a presenter from SLYCAN Trust who will give more information about what we do and who we are. And we identify ourselves as a think tank, and also implement projects that link to our research. So the first speaker for the day today is Ms. Miva Keto, who's a program officer at UNFCCC, and she'll be speaking on the overview of the Warsaw International Mechanism and the work that UNFCCC does related to this topic that we're focusing on. So Miva, it's all yours. I'm going to switch myself off.
Thank you, Vasudha, for the kind introduction and also inviting me for this webinar series. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I have been asked to introduce Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage and its task force on displacement. In the next 10 minutes or so, I will briefly touch upon how the human mobility issues evolved in under the UNFCCC, the types of climate change risks and impacts which Warsaw International Mechanism aims to address, and how the mechanism is organized to facilitate collaboration across stakeholders, and how the task force on displacement functions and where things are currently stands. The countries most vulnerable to climate change, for instance, the small island developing states, the least developed countries, and countries in Africa, traditionally have been the strongest driving force in advancing the international agenda on climate change adaptation under the UNFCCC. The topic of human mobility first got traction in the UNFCCC process in the context of enhanced action on adaptation. This was at COP16 back in 2010. At that time, all the parties were invited to enhance their action on adaptation by undertaking measures to enhance understanding, coordination, and cooperation with regard to climate change-induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation at the national, regional, and international level. A few years later, parties came to realization that there may be some cases of climate change impacts which involve more than that, which can be reduced by adaptation. At COP19, 2013, parties established the Warsaw International Mechanism to promote the implementation of approaches to address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts in a comprehensive, integrated, and coherent manner. Some of our audience today are at the front line of experiencing the adverse effects of climate change on the ground. So you have first-hand experience that climate change can threaten the resilience and safety of people, sometimes causing them to become displaced from their homes and communities. It is in this context that UN climate change policy responded to the needs to help countries avert, minimize, and address displacement related to adverse effects of climate change by establishing the Task Force on Displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism. This was done at COP21 back in 2015. Let me now take a few moments to briefly introduce Warsaw International Mechanism under which the Task Force on Displacement operates. I wanted to share with you this infographics, which visually lays out some of the key climate hazards which our work seeks to address, along with some examples of economic and also non-economic losses from the adverse effects of climate change. In terms of extreme weather events, you will see here the storm surges, tropical cyclones, floods, drought, and heat waves. Please also take note of slow onset event. the term used to describe slow and incremental climatic processes. Examples of slow-onset events include sea level rise, ocean acidifications, salinization, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, increase in temperatures, glacial retreat, and desertification. In terms of the losses, which may result from extreme and slow-onset events, the mechanism categorizes them by economic and non-economic. The non-economic losses encompass a broad range of items that are not economic and not commonly traded in markets, but impacting individuals, societies, and environment. For instance, at the individual level, the loss of life in the event of floods or heat wave, or loss of good health caused by food crisis from reduction in agriculture production triggered by changing temperature or rain patterns. At the societal level, an example of non-economic losses can include, for instance, loss of indigenous local knowledge or societal cohesion or identity when affected people and communities move from one location to another, whether planned or forced. The items on this slide are non-exhaustive, but I hope it gives the idea of the extensive range of themes and risks that are under the purview of the loss and damage mechanism. This slide shows the operation modality of the Warsaw International Mechanism and how the mechanism convenes relevant stakeholders from under and outside of the UNFCCC process. As some of you know, the mechanism is a key vehicle to address loss and damage. The mechanism has three functions: enhancing understanding and knowledge, promote cooperation and collaboration, and enhancing action and support. The Executive Committee guides the implementation of these functions through its rolling work plan. The committee serves as the bridge between the UNFCCC process and processes outside of the Climate Change Convention. One of the key strengths of the mechanism is its convening power, and it has the ability to facilitate a wide range of stakeholders with thematic expertise to work together on loss and damage. The establishment of expert group is a specific way in which this expertise is leveraged. These expert groups assist with implementing activities of the committee's 5-year rolling work plan. Now let me zoom into the key milestones of the task force on displacement. As mentioned earlier, the task force was established in 2015. Its mandate was to develop recommendations for integrated approach to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effects of climate change. The task force comprises 13 members who collectively represents perspectives from development, adaptation, human mobility, humanitarian, and civil society voices. The task force also engages with the UNFCCC LDC expert group to channel these developed countries' perspectives. We have two members from the task force with us today in this webinar. Atle and Miriam will tell us about the highlights of their work and how the task force contributes to increasing synergies in the overall efforts on the nexus between human mobility and climate change. So I will only outline outcomes of the work of the task force to date in the remaining few minutes I have. After 2 years of compiling evidence, conducting studies, identifying effective practices, and consulting stakeholders, the task force forwarded its recommendations on the integrated approach to the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism. And the parties subsequently adopted these recommendations at COP24. These recommendations collectively provide a range of actions and policy instruments that aim to strengthen policies, institutional frameworks, and tools and guidelines. They also aim to enhance the preparedness and the capacity of national and local governments to address climate-related drivers and the impacts of displacement. They also stress the importance of enhancing knowledge, data collection, and monitoring of risks and coordination in policy coherence. Implementation of these recommendations will help national and local governments, stakeholders, and affected communities better understand and better prepared to address challenges in future where more people will likely be forced to move in the context of adverse climate change and disasters. This is my last slide. The task force is in its second phase of work to facilitate the implementation of these recommendations. The implementation requires commitment, engagement, and collaboration from a wide range of actors, not only parties and those bodies under the UNFCCCs, but also with other stakeholders in all corners of the world to work together in a coordinated manner. I hope that many of you working on this climate change and human mobility nexus will take up these recommendations in your work to help affected communities better understand and respond to displacement in the context of climate change now, today, and in future. Let me conclude my input on this note. I went over quickly a lot of information, and I hope it contributes to your understanding of Warsaw International Mechanism and serves as an introduction to the work of Task Force on Displacement. Thank you, and I give the floor back to you, Voshita.
Thank you very much, Miwa. You kept the presentation exactly to the time slot allocated, so that's great. Moving next, we have Mr. Atlas Holbert, who's the head of the Secretariat for Platform on Disaster Displacement. He's also a member of the Task Force on Displacement under the WIM. So he'll be speaking about the work that they do and also what the WIM does. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and congratulations to the organizer for organizing this webinar. We are very excited to be joining you today. I'm speaking to you from Geneva. I work for something called the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and we have a secretariat based here in Geneva. The Platform on Disaster Displacement is state-led, and we are currently under the chairmanship of France, and Fiji is our vice chair. And we are very excited to welcome Fiji as chair when they take over in January next year. We are somehow a complicated or complex animal or architecture. So I'll say a few words on the Platform on Disaster Displacement, what we do, and then I will link that directly to what we do in the context of the Task Force on Displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism, and why the issue of loss and damage and climate change is so important for our work. And I'll try also to keep myself on time. I also need to learn or understand how I can move the slides, and it seems like I'm able to do that. So first of all, I want to remind everyone that when we talk about disaster displacement, which is one type of human mobility, as Miwa mentioned, there are different types of human mobility in the context of the adverse effect of climate change, and displacement is one type of mobility, and it's important to recall that we are talking about a large number of people that are displaced in the context of disasters. So the slide in front of you is data from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and they estimate that around 25 million people are every year displaced in the context of disasters. And this is, of course, broader than what we can attribute to climate change. But what is important is that the majority of the natural hazards that lead to displacement are weather-related, whether these are storms or floods, cyclones, tropical cyclones or hurricanes. These are the majority of the natural hazard that is behind displacement in the context of disasters. And that's a big number. And also recognizing that this data doesn't really give us an understanding of what is mobility and displacement in the context of the slow onset events and processes that Miva referenced in the work of the Warsaw International Mechanism. And that's a data gap. So there is most likely, or we know that there are other people that a certain level of compulsions are forced or compelled to move in the context of the adverse effect of climate change, and we need to know that much better, and that is also part of the work of the task force. Just one word on the platform on disaster displacement. Our objective is to strengthen or support states to strengthen the protection of people that are displaced across borders in the context of disaster and adverse effect of climate change. And that's important also to mention that when we talk about disasters, we also refer to disaster linked to natural hazard of a geophysical nature. So we also deal with situation of tsunamis. We know that Sri Lanka was also hit by a tsunami 15 years ago, and also natural hazard related to volcanic eruptions and earthquake. We are also aiming to find ways to develop policies and measures that can prevent and reduce the risk of disaster displacement. That is very important, and I come back to that a bit later. That in the toolbox of measures and action we need to do to avert, minimize, and address displacement, we also have to focus on the prevention and the reduction sides. One key aspect of our work, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that, is that we work also on those situations that occurs when people cross international borders. And that's a legal gap at the current state of affairs in international law and policies. And it's very simple. If you happen to be forced to go to another country in the context of a disaster, or you happen to have to leave your country because your house or your homeland is underwater, or whether the environmental degradation has reached a point where livelihood is almost impossible, there's very little in international law and policy that can give orientation to states and that says what states shall do. So this is what we refer to as a legal gap, and a lot of our work is to work around better migration, governance, and protection in those situations where people are forced to move across international border. So just mentioning that as part of our work. One important tool in our work, and I invite you to also look this up at the internet or at our website, if you have not heard about it, is the what we call the Nuns Initiative Protection Agenda. And this is an agenda that was developed under the Nuns Initiative, which was the predecessor to the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And it essentially compiles practices and policies and good examples of how states and others can avert, minimize, and address disaster displacement. So what is we often refer to as a toolbox of effective practices that can give inspiration and motivation to states and others to scale up their practices and find ways to better protect people that are displaced, but also find ways to prevent and reduce the risk of displacement. The toolbox can be very much, or the protection agenda can very much be presented as a toolbox. We have compiled and we are promoting what are those measures that can be used to help people stay. So then, of course, climate change actions such as mitigation, adaptation are key to find ways so people have the resilience so they can stay, so people do not have to move. We know that people do not want to move. We also have in the toolbox of the protection agenda all those measures that can make sure that movement is safe and that rights are protected. For example, if governments are forced to start relocating people, or if communities decide to engage in a planned relocation process, what are the standards and the rights that needs to be protected in this situation? And finally, what could be some of the principles and tools that protect people that cross international borders? I don't need probably to say to this audience why climate change is important for our work, or why is climate change action important for our work. It's clear that we need to scale up our climate change ambitions. We need to reduce greenhouse gases. We will most likely, if global temperatures continues to increase, we will see more displacement related to the adverse effect of climate change in the future, and the risk of it will clearly increase. Climate change action is also important to scale up adaptation. There will be already locked in effects of the adverse effect of climate change, and we need to scale up our adaptation efforts to build resilience of people so they don't have to move or they are compelled to move. And we could also think of climate change adaptation measures to make mobility safer and more regular, and also that rights are protected. It is also important, and I'm coming to that now while concluding my intervention, is that work under loss and damage, displacement in the context of the adverse effect of climate change is loss and damage, and it is important to scale up our work on loss and damage to ensure more financing and more capacity and more support to those countries and those communities that are most adversely affected by the adverse effect of climate change. Miva has already said a few words on the task force on displacement, and as I mentioned at the outset, we are member with other colleagues in the task force on displacement. And this is very quickly before I wrap up my intervention. This is how we work on some of the recommendation and what is now part of the plan of action of the task force on displacement. When I say we, I refer to the platform on disaster displacement, the state members of our platform, our advisory committee members, many of those also online in this webinar, and some of the UN organizations we work with, including in particular IOM and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So we see the task force on displacement and being placed under the Warsaw International Mechanism as a very good space where we can complement and contribute to other efforts of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So we work very much across different policy agenda, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, the 2 global compacts on migration and on refugees, and of course what work is happening under the Task Force on Displacement and the UNFCCC in general. Many of the elements of our work is about the what. What do we do to avert, minimize, and address displacement? And this is back to the toolbox I mentioned earlier in the presentation. What can we do through climate change adaptation, risk reduction, and other measures to help people stay and build their resilience? But an important work is also the how. What do we have to work with in terms of international policies, practices, tools, and guidelines to make those interventions effective? And the good news is there is a growing body of policies and tools that we can work on to strengthen action and support at the local level. One very important work we are doing, and which I alluded to maybe in one of the first slides, is that we need to better understand the risk and the risk related to climate change and the risk of displacement, to build preparedness and try to understand where will people most likely be at risk of displacement. This is an area where we have to strengthen our knowledge and also to provide that kind of information to policymaker and decision maker so they can plan for this and also include it into the development planning. I'm sure Marian will say a few words about how do we make sure that human mobility challenges, for example, in risk areas, are included into national adaptation planning processes. So we work in different regions on this, particularly in the Pacific, but we also have some upcoming projects in the Greater Horn of Africa to work with governments to make sure that when they do their adaptation planning, they factor in the challenges of human mobility. I also defer to Marian maybe to talk about safe, regular, and responsible migration. This is about the protection side of our work and also the migration governance. And also, finally, I think the work has just started, but the task force on displacement and what we do is really to try to support increased finance, increased access to technology, and increased capacity building for developing countries and those most adversely impacted by the adverse effect of climate change. So this ends my presentation. I hope I was able to explain how we as a platform with a range of stakeholders are able to work in different spaces. And I think that's maybe the key message I want to give, and maybe we can discuss this later, that we need to do this together. This is too big for one individual agency or for one individual to do. You have to apply this toolbox. You have to use all the tools we have in the box and work together in order to avert, minimize, and address the displacement related to the adverse effect of climate change. So over to you, Voshita. Thank you very much.
For that very interesting presentation. We will be taking questions after all the presenters, the panelists have spoken. So please hold your questions, or you can type it into the chat box, but preferably when we start the discussion. So now we have another speaker, Ms. Mariam Shazal Noel. She's from IOM, and she works as a thematic specialist on migration, environment, and climate change. So now we pass the mic to her.
Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm always happy to be part of this kind of discussions. I think that's one of the beauty of our work. We get to talk to so many different people from different communities of practice, and we always learn from them. So on my side, I've really been trying to think about how the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, and the Task Force on Displacement have changed the way that we work in my organization. So my organization, the International Organization for Migration, IOM in short, it's a big UN agencies. We have a global footprint. We have offices, hundreds of offices in lots of different countries. We work on the whole range of migration issues. And one of the topic that has come up for us in the last 10 years is the question of people migrating in the context of climate change. So of course, this interest in working on this specific dimension didn't come out of nowhere. We had a lot of our member states, because we're a state-led organization, coming to us and asking for help, expertise on how to address this kind of phenomenon, which are not new, but are becoming more and more visible. So for many years, this was a topic which was, I would say, which was understood, but not very visible. And that's where the work of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and especially the Task Force on Displacement, has made a major difference. It brought so much visibility to this topic. It really increased the legitimacy that this is an important topic and not just something that we can wait to address in a few years. It really put the topic on the global map, and states have really taken grown the awareness of the fact that this is a question that needs to be addressed right now. So they come to us as IOM because they have this growing awareness that they cannot wait, they need to anticipate what's happening in the future, and they need support for that. So that for me is probably the major achievement of the WIM, is to have really brought up this, brought up this awareness in global areas, but not only in the climate change communities, but also in the migration policy communities. So as IOM, our main interlocutors are the ministries that deal with migration issues, or the permanent missions in New York or Geneva, who are working on migration and mobility issues. But now that what we are realizing is that these people who only had the migration expertise in the first place, they have connected the dots. So they now really are aware that there is a whole strand of work ongoing under the UNFCCC, and that there is a need to connect the migration policy dialogue with the climate change policy dialogue. So when it comes to that, concretely speaking, we do get requests, for instance, in some countries to review their overall policy framework, the national laws, regulations, plans and policies which are in the country, and try to understand whether they are complementary, or if they need to be maybe tweaked or changed so that they can comprehensively address all types of migration in the context of climate change. So one recent example of that I can think of, it's ongoing in Tajikistan in Central Europe. We are working with the migration ministries and the climate change entities in the country to review their national policy framework and try to understand what could potentially be changed so that this framework actually precisely address the recommendations of the Task Force on Displacement. So we are taking basically the recommendations of the Task Force on Displacement, and we are going one by one, and we are trying to answer whether these recommendations are applied to in this specific country. So these are obviously like a new kind of work because the recommendations are not that old, but they're already triggering at the national level this desire from states to check whether they are following the guidance, the recommendations, because they are considered as good recommendations. Also, these recommendations are very broad, which is good because it does give us several entry points for us as an organization that supports states to work on different sides of what we call the climate and migration nexus. So I just talked about the national policy side, so bringing the climate change policy and the migration policy together. But obviously, this is also happening at the regional level. This is something that ATLE and PDD are very, very active in. So maybe we can say a few words about it later on. But that's another, I would say that's another kind of work which is really helped by the fact that the recommendations of the Task Force on Displacement exist and that they are taken seriously. Now, because as well these recommendations exist, we get more and more donors who are interested in supporting IOM to support vulnerable countries to implement these recommendations at the national level. So for instance, in terms of, there's a recommendation on data, knowledge, and understanding. So this is a kind of work that we already do a lot in many different countries. I would say maybe a most recent example would be in the Pacific. I mean, that's also something that Atle mentioned, but we do have this kind of work ongoing in many places in the world. What we also get, and again, directly linked to the work and the recognition that the Task Force on Displacement has created, is national migration policymakers asking us to basically explain to them, but also equip them with relevant knowledge, terminology, and an understanding of how they can go to different global and regional policy forums and bring these questions to the table. So that's also another thing that we're seeing, and which was not really prominent before the work of the Task Force on Displacement. And conversely, we also get countries approaching us like Mali or Senegal from a climate change, the national climate change negotiators, asking us to support them to understand better the migration dimensions, so that the next time they go to the conference of the parties, they do have enough of an understanding of the topic so that they can meaningfully contribute. There's also, in the recommendation, there's also a whole strand of work which is related to facilitating migration in the context of climate change. So I think this is a very important dimension, which was not necessarily well known before. And at the moment, I mean, there's a lot of thinking around that. How do you indeed afford protection and or create new migration policy tools that can help people who simply cannot stay where they are? But there's also the dimension of, for us, at least at IOM, we're also thinking in terms of returns of migrants, because some migrants do want to return to their own countries. They usually benefit from some kind of reintegration package, but this is very often very divorced from the whole climate change dimension. And very often that's why migrant reintegration fail, because the activities that they are focusing on in terms of reintegration are not suitable in the context of a changing climate and what the impacts on livelihoods are. So there's all sorts of ways in which the different migration domains of practice can be affected. And I really think that the recommendations of the Task Force on Displacement help to bring attention to that, but also to give a legitimacy that we can work on this facilitating migration dimension. And maybe the final thing I would say is that and I think it's been touched upon already by the two previous presenters, but it's worth saying it again. What the WIM and the Task Force on Displacement has created, it is this network of expertise and bringing really the migration displacement people together with the climate change experts. And this is new, I would say. I don't think it was happening even 10 years ago. And this has implications in other policy discussions, because obviously when we talk about the WIM and the task force, we're talking about the climate change negotiations. As Atle mentioned, there's been another very important UN negotiated text, including something called the Global Compact for Migration, which was the first UN agreement on migration dimensions. And this includes a whole section on the impacts of climate change on migration. So of course, these texts are important as policy texts, but they also have very practical applications, because for organizations like mine, this is the gateway to funding, to projects development, to developing programming in the field with the populations. Without these texts, without this global awareness, without the donor interest, then we cannot go and help populations in the field. So we start with the WIM and the task force bringing more visibility, more coherence, more legitimacy, and then it ends with projects in different parts of the world, from West Africa to the Pacific, and it really can change the life of people who are affected in the field. So looking at the future, where I think as well that what I've noticed in my work, and I think that what will change as well, thanks to the work of the Task Force on Displacement, is that we have started receiving, finding opportunities to develop programs on migration, but under climate-related funds. So for instance, in North Macedonia and in Moldova, we have a couple of projects which are under development. It's not just IOM, but it's a consortium of agencies. For instance, UNDP, so more specialized in climate change impacts, and we are brought in to bring the migration dimension. But usually so far, all the activities we have implemented, they were usually funded by migration-related funds. But now we are saying that there is an opportunity to use climate-related funds. And in these project proposals that we are developing and in the discussions we're having with the partners, then the work and the recommendation of the Task Force on Displacement really played a key role in convincing the related climate fund that migration could be included as part of projects which are being conceptualized. So I will stop here, and thank you very much.
Mariam, a lot of information on how things work with IOM and other partners of the WIM. Now we have Dennis Momba, who's the Director of Research and Education at SLYCAN Trust, who'll be sharing some of our work that we do on the topic of climate migration and also related to WIM. So over to you.
All right, thank you, Rosita. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Dennis Momba. I'm Director of Research and Education at SLYCAN Trust, and I'm going to talk about evidence-based actions on climate-induced migration and how to integrate climate migration and displacement into policy processes. And already in the first presentation, Miva mentioned the importance of the commitment, engagement, and collaboration with stakeholders and partners across the world. I think it was echoed also by Atle, and then with the network of expertise by Mariam. So this is something that is quite important and something that I want to talk about. So why is it so important to have evidence-based actions? Loss and damage as related to climate-induced migration and displacement has a lot of different dimensions. There are economic and non-economic losses and damages. There are those affecting the migrants, the host communities, and families staying behind, and also the human systems that are impacted and natural systems, ecosystems. I won't go into too much detail how this relates to the VIM because it was already covered, I think, in the previous presentations. But it is important to address the nexus of human mobility and climate change through concrete policies and projects, and to take existing policies, best practices, case studies, experiences, lessons learned into account and build on them, and to enhance and optimize policies, institutional framework to address climate migration. How can this be integrated into policies? There are actually a number of different ways. So we often talk about NDCs mostly. Some of them have a loss and damage component. Many of them cover like risk management and other adaptive measures under the adaptation sectors. But these are not the only policies that can relate to migration and loss and damage. There are those related to food security and nutrition, to the development of the rural sector, as it also relates to the SDGs, to sustainable development, economic diversification, to enhance the rural economy and prevent migration, at least maladaptive migration. It's relevant to health, both of the migrants and the non-migrants, and both physical and mental health. It reflects itself in labor policies, in work regulations, in social security, in risk management. For example, in the very first webinar we had in the series back in May, we talked about the example of Uganda, where there are a lot of refugees coming in and they settle in areas that are already under stress due to climate change impacts. And they were dependent on the natural resources that are there, on groundwater, forests, and these things. So one way to address this is preemptive planning, to plant trees, create water management plans, have a cleaner energy sources, and address all these areas that we know refugees are going to settle in. And then, of course, risk reduction, risk transfer, climate insurance. These are all instruments that are very important to reduce climate change as a migration driver and a push factor. Education, child well-being, child development, also awareness of people, capacity building. Social cohesion is affected, social security, I already mentioned, both of families and communities. And then, of course, the environment is impacted. Ecosystem services might not be sufficient for migrants in areas they move into, or the lack of ecosystem services or degradation might be an additional push factor that needs to be addressed. In Sri Lanka, there are a number of dimensions of human mobility. Sri Lanka is quite climate vulnerable. A large part of the population lives in projected hotspots. And there's already a lot of internal migration going on, as well as labor migration abroad, which is a major source of remittances and an important part of the economy. So here, permanent internal migration, temporary disaster displacement, departures for foreign employment, and cyclical economic migration. For the last one, we did a case study in Trincomalee district in the northeast of Sri Lanka, across a number of villages there. Almost everyone in these villages has experienced climate change impacts, mostly droughts, shifting rainfall patterns, temperature increase, reduced water retention and groundwater scarcity. And the response to this has in many cases been economic problems and then migration. And usually, as we can see, out of all the respondents, 80% have a family member who migrated, and 72% it's a husband. So it's usually the men of the family who migrate to cities. We see 87%. Colombo, Sri Lanka's capital city, is a major destination. And they migrate in search of employment and sources of income, often only for short periods of time, for a couple of months at a time. They come back to the village for harvest season or like for a few weeks. Then they go back to the cities. That also means on the flip side that those staying behind are the women, the children, youth, elderly, and special needs. And they have experienced financial problems. They don't have a proper income. They are burdened with triple responsibilities child care and house care, of providing like an income, and then also of taking over agricultural work. And this impacts all the sectors I mentioned above: education, nutrition, child development, health, social cohesion, the efficiency of traditional risk-sharing mechanisms when women have to take over agriculture but don't have the same access to land rights or to farmer groups, water groups, government water access, and also ecosystem services. And this is addressed, loss and damage, in Sri Lanka's NDCs. There's next to the, apart from the mitigation and adaptation sectors, is a loss and damage sector, which has several commitments that are related to the WIM. For example, the analysis of total loss and damage of climate-induced disasters, and also the compensation gap, those damages that are not being compensated in any way. And this is supposed to result in recommendations for a national WIM mechanism. And then the next commitment would be to establish a local mechanism in line with the WIM. And there's also the introduction of insurance schemes to recover losses and damages. Sri Lanka already has some insurance schemes, but there are gaps that could be addressed, and they could be strengthened, and there's not enough awareness of those. In addition, there are a number of other policies in Sri Lanka that address things related to migration. There are disaster management policies, risk reduction policies, and also a national migration health policy that addresses the health of both migrants and those staying behind, and both internal migrants and international migrants. I can't go into more detail on this. We do work outside of Sri Lanka with a number of other countries and local partners there. You can find more information on our Adaptation and Resilience Knowledge Hub. We'll drop a link into the chat box, where we have a large range of knowledge products that relate to this. You have some examples that we have partially developed with our local partner organizations, some of which are even on this call right now. And there's more than that. There are webinars, recorded ones, interviews, videos, training materials, presentations, research papers, policy briefs, all kinds of documents that relate to this. Please have a look if you're interested. And I think I'm running out of time now. I thank you very much for your attention, and I will give it back to Rosita. Thank you very much.
So now we will open the floor for questions and answers. Before we do, I would remind everyone to fill the survey for participation, so we have an understanding of who's joining us today and who's participating in the webinar series, so we can engage with you on the topic in the work we do. Senashia, my colleague, would share this link again. So please take a minute to fill this. It's not that long. And now I will first take the questions from Miva, because she highlighted she had another meeting she might have to rush off to. I would quickly like to ask everyone who has questions to Miva, maybe 3 or 4 questions that we'll take first, and then we'll have all the panelists answering questions that you have. So if you have questions for Miva specifically, please say to Miva and then type the question in. And your question will be featured on the screen, and we'll ask our presenters to answer them. Thank you. So I think there are a few that we already have. If we can just start getting them on the screen, we can get them answered. Right, so maybe we could request all our presenters to have their videos on, and then to unmute yourself when you answer the questions. One, how can other entities engage in the work of the WIM? I think that might be interesting to those who are attending today to identify and see the avenues for engagement.
All right. Thank you, Salim, who put this question. Thank you, Salim, and it's good to I can see you. Good to know that you're present. The Salim has been a long-time supporter of advancing loss and damage agenda under the UNFCCC. So thank you. So yes, the WIM-EXCOM. Yes, there was a plan to take up task force on displacement issues at its first meeting this year, which was scheduled for March this year. It was postponed because of the COVID pandemic issue. The next WIM-EXCOM meeting is going to take place in October, where all the expert groups will have a chance to provide updates and discuss issues of mutual interest to increase the collaboration and the synergy in conducting their own respective work. So hopefully that we will be able to provide sufficient meeting time for the task force on displacement topic. So the meeting, yes, is planned to take place in October. The notifications of these meetings should be out in the next couple of weeks to everyone. Back to you, Fosita. Should I take this one now too? Well, yes, so there are a number of ways that the stakeholders, organizations can get involved in the work of loss and damage under the WIM. As an individual experts, there's a roster of the WIM roster of experts that one could register to. And we and the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism regularly use this the roster to reach out to experts when the certain specific areas of expertise is needed. So that's one way. And then there are ways to engage through the work of the thematic expert groups as well. Currently, the executive committee has two thematic expert groups. One is the task force on displacement, which we discussed today. Another one is comprehensive risk management expert group. This year, in the coming few months or so, the 3 more expert groups will be launched under the Warsaw International Mechanism. One specifically looks at issues on slow onset events, another one on non-economic losses, and another one broadly to look at the action and support, in particular to facilitate the mobilization of finance, technology, and capacity building to developing countries. So there are a number of ways to do so.
I hope you can all hear me because I'm having some issue with the mic. Yes, great. Okay, finally. So the questions for Miwa, if we have any more, we can take. Miwa, I think you need to leave now, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So thank you very much for attending the webinar today. And we are very grateful that you took the time to participate. I will take, we are not stopping now. We have more questions coming up. No, actually, you're not going to leave anytime soon. So we're going to take the rest of the questions and the floor will be open for the other panelists to respond to them. So can we have the next question that's on the screen? And we could ask you, the speakers, to decide who would like to take this question. We'll have the next question on the screen, please. Yes, this is to Atle. So Atle, over to you.
Thank you. I think that's a great question, and I think that's one of the challenge we have to actually do that. And I think to be very honest and realistic and try to explain that what we can do as PDD is more at the policy level, and that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but I'll try to explain what I mean by that. What we do now is that very often human mobility challenges, let's say the need to relocate a community or cost related to displacement, people have lost their houses. These kind of costs and loss and damage are not factored into very often into the disaster risk management strategy. It's not factored into the national adaptation planning, and a few places they are factored into the development planning, but very often not. So what our contribution there is, and we do this through a few projects at regional level, is to support states at the technical level that the human mobility challenges are then included and factored into, for example, a sector policy or a disaster risk management or a adaptation planning. And by factoring into official policy documents, you will then be able to go to the next step, which will then be to ensure funding. For example, funding under your development planning, or even funding under the Green Climate Fund. This is one of the most difficult issues, and there are fundamental institutional barriers. For example, to have a planned relocation project in any specific countries to be used for or to seek funding under the Green Climate Fund or adaptation funding. So that is why I try to explain that it needs to be solved at the policy level, so it becomes the challenge, for example, either planned relocation or the loss and damage related to displacement, are factored into the policy, and then that can be used to access financing. And this is part of the task force on displacement work, but we haven't really done that next step very systematically yet, or very few examples. We have a few examples through our project. I think the key message I'm trying to give in some of the projects we are working on is that get this into your adaptation planning, get this into your NDCs. If you include the mobility challenge or displacement into your official policy documents that you, for example, submit to the UNFCCC, then we can start to talk about having access to the financing mechanism. So it's also an aim we are having and an aspiration in that sense. I do hope I was able to answer your question, Romao. That was a great question and a very important issue where we all have to scale up our efforts.
We can take all the questions that come in.
Yeah. That's also a great question, Kimbova. We, as PDD, I'm not sure whether I was able to go into detail to that, has a primary focus on cross-border disaster displacement. But when we adopted our new strategy by our steering group and member countries, there was also a call for us to work more on focus or internal displacement, internal disaster displacement. And this has been a priority for us the last year, actually. So I invite you to, for example, go into the website of something called the High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement. They invited for submission to the High-Level Panel, which was a panel that was established by the Secretary General, and they are tasked to strengthen the system and strengthen our efforts to find solutions to internal displacement, but also to build up our capacity to prevent and prepare for it. So we have engaged both in the work of the high-level panel, and our submission fleshes out the policy recommendation that we see as important. We have also worked with the special rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons, Cecilia Jimenez from the Philippines, and she is about to issue her report to the General Assembly on internal displacement in the context of the adverse effect of climate change. So again, these are two examples where we have been working closely to promote some of the policy recommendation and the lesson learned we have seen. And we have also, of course, included this in some of our regional projects, both in the Pacific and what we are developing in Africa and in the Americas. So that distinction cross-border internal is not that strong for us anymore, or rather say it's not that important. And we are also, of course, very systematically focusing on the resilience agenda, which I mentioned. How do we make sure that risks are reduced and risks are adapted to? Hope that was good on that, Kimbova. And if I may, sorry, I didn't see that. East Africa, we are in these days submitting a regional project together with IOM, ILO, UNHCR on work in the IGAD region on disaster displacement. So there we will also work on the slow onset aspects. We know both droughts and flooding is key natural hazards leading to displacement in the east of Africa. So please contact me through our website, and I can share the project proposal we are about to submit on work in the IGAD region.
Right. Thank you. No, sorry. Can we get the question that was there from Rangita? So there's a question that is from IOM Sri Lanka. I think I'd like to ask Mariam and maybe Dennis both to answer this question. First, let's have Mariam, so you can have a general overview of the question, and then we'll pass it to Dennis for like connection.
So I think I'll let you respond on the Sri Lanka specific aspects, but I think this question really is more than relevant right now, because if you think of the question of COVID-19, what it will mean or means, or will mean now in a few months or in a few years for people who are migrating in the context of climate change. This is 100% one of the dimensions that we need to be thinking about. So I don't have a response as to how this should be done, but if I do have to predict something, I think this question, specifically on question of remittances and returning migrants, that will be something which will be big on the policy agenda, and probably a question of very some interest to the European countries. But we have to see how it happens. But yes, looking at the future, that is one of the dimensions that we want to work on and that we anticipate will be a big issue. Over.
Dennis, would you like to add something to this? There's also a specific question for you that is there, but you can also add to this if you would like.
All right. Yeah, thank you for the question, Rangita. I mean, if there should be a specific climate migration policy is a good question. It definitely is the case, I think, that climate migration, especially this internal and not permanent migration, should be addressed in policies, and I think there is a gap that is there in Sri Lanka. Because there are definitely, like the National Migration Health Policy that I mentioned, addresses a lot of issues, but it doesn't specifically refer to climate change. And it doesn't address like the non-health issues. So it needs to be connected with disaster-related policies, with risk management, and then also with rural development. And I think the connection that is not there is between the migrants going to cities and being there for a short period of time and then going back to the rural areas. I think a specific policy might be, I mean, maybe you're even better qualified than me to answer this, but I think either a specific policy should be there or that should be embedded into the existing policies and linked up in a way, maybe with some institutional setup that it can address both the migrants and the permanently staying behind.
Thank you for that answer. Can we have the last question? We have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to take the question. So let's park this because we have the general question on NDCs, which I think all the speakers could answer, but I'll start with Mariam and Dennis, and then I'll go to Atle, which was on how NDCs and the policy processes that are ongoing in countries at the moment could focus on climate migration and displacement. So Mariam, would you like to start in answering this question if you're on the call, and then maybe Dennis, and then I'll pass the final remarks to Atle to close the session.
Sure. So, I mean, how can NDC include migration? I mean, first of all, a few already included, so it has happened in the past. So it's not like there is no migration anywhere in these documents. I mean, on our side, we really do believe that we can create some kind of guidelines that gives a general understanding of what to look out for and how to integrate this dimension in different parts of different text. Of course, this remains general, so you really do have to work country by country. But on my side, I think there is willingness to do that. I mean, we get approached quite regularly to do such work. It's also a very recent kind of work, so we don't have all the lessons learned from this kind of exercise. And it is something that we'll need to be looking at, like what did we learn from the examples that we already have. But yes, I mean, again, another priority. I mean, for IOM, for us, we're really looking at it from 2 different perspectives: integrating migration, climate dimensions in migration, national policies, but also the other way around, including migration in all the climate-related documents, guidelines, and policies. And then I'll pass on to Dennis.
Yeah, so as Mariam said, I believe around like 20% of NDCs already mention migration in some way. Most of them in Africa, and I think 1/3 of the NDCs in Asia, in the Pacific. But I mean, it is very country-specific how to integrate, I think, migration to NDCs. There are different examples that we have come across in our work. For example, in Niger, it is addressed as like a issue of basically rural development. So to stop migration from rural areas, it focuses on climate-smart agriculture, risk transfer instruments, on water management, on strengthening the rural economy, offering more diversified jobs, and thereby stopping migration streams. But of course, there's also an issue of like transboundary migration among pastoralist communities. So these would have to be addressed in very different ways. I think it's highly country-specific how to integrate migration into NDCs. But I think it is an issue that is relevant for most, if not all countries, or will be relevant quite soon. I think now I'll pass to Adley. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think I can add much to that. I think the message must be it's important, and I think that is one of the advantages. And at times it looks, like a small thing. Miwa mentioned in 2010 there was a paragraph 14F on climate-induced migration, displacement, planned relocation. But parties did then commit to look into these issues to strengthen coordination, cooperation, and understanding. And I think also the same with the COP decision that gave the Warsaw International Mechanism to create the task force on displacement. It shows that there should be commitment by states and parties to work on these issues. So I think the fact that Dennis mentioned 20%, we need more of these examples. They need to be country specific, but we do have the references both in the climate change context. I mentioned the Cancun adaptation framework and also decision on loss and damage. We have these decisions also made under the migration compact. There are specific commitments to do this work also from a migration perspective. So there are objectives under the global compact for migration, and we find the same recognition in some of the global policy on disaster risk reduction, particularly the SENDA framework on disaster risk reduction. So I think what we can do is what we have done today: bring different stakeholders together, work very hard on formulating recommendation to governments and support governments when they are developing their NDC, and also remind them maybe what they have actually agreed on at global level. I think that's a good starting point. And I think it's immensely important. That's the benchmark of our next level of achievement is when national policies recognizes the challenge of human mobility in the context of the adverse effect of climate change, and they start to formulate specific policies to find ways to avert, address, and minimize, and also include these in national budget, for example. I see in the chat fields the reference to some of the practices in Fiji, which I think is something we should highlight. That Fiji has included. They have policies on planned relocation, but beyond that, they also have a national trust fund that ensures funding for a situation where planned relocation needs to be undertaken. So there's also a corresponding financial commitment to some of the policy recommendation, which is important, and this should be included in the NDCs. Oshita, I hand over to you. I see you are patient to cut me off now.
Sorry, we have 1 more minute, and thank you very much for all the information shared today. I just wanted to highlight to those who asked questions and those questions that we could not answer, we'll ask the speakers if they were directly addressed to them, maybe to reply on email. There was a question from Namrata to Dennis. I think he'll answer now, or else I'll drop you an email. So thank you very much for joining us today, especially to the speakers, Miwa, Atle, Dennis, and Mariam, for giving us your time. And we apologize for the technical errors we had today. Bit gloomy weather, I'm going with that as the technical issue that we have. But thank you for joining and keeping active during the webinar throughout. Till next time, I'm going to sign off from here, and bye for now. And thank you for everyone for joining. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.